Welcome everyone. I just want to thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking about this incredible book, The Art of Strategic Change, by Lennox Joseph and Daniel Fremion. And I love this book. This book is so incredible. It's so thick. It's so incredible, and I loved every bit that I read. Um, but before we get into it, I just want to introduce Lennox and Daniel. So Lennox is a native of Trinidad, West Indies. He is an educator, organization development specialist, and change management authority. I met Lennox, I can't believe it was 10 years ago already, at the ISODC conference in Amsterdam.
Hmm.
Uh, he is recognized for his expertise in organizational leadership, management development, change implementation, specializing in strategy formulation and implementation, organizational transformation and renewal, cultural change, design, and delivery of learning systems, and in integrating diversity values into strategic and operational plans. Daniel is an independent OD consultant and trainer. Daniel retired from Shell Oil Company, where he was the general manager for software engineering excellence in the Subsurface and Wells directorate. In his role, he was responsible for a cultural change effort that transformed an internal software development organization from a collection of independent research-oriented teams using a wide variety of tools and practices to an agile, cohesive software engineering department using modern practices and techniques. Wow, I bet that was quite an endeavor, Daniel.
Hmm.
It was. It was.
So I just want to welcome those who have joined us and those who are watching the replay. And I just want to ask you, why did you write this book, this incredible book?
Go ahead, Lennox. You can start.
Okay. There were a couple reasons why we were really drawn to write it. Um, First of all, the oftentimes I was called in when I was doing both my internal work and external work at of OD. I was called in to help with or to create interventions that would move a system, um, through some particularly challenging piece of it. And by the time I got into those organizations, there was a whole mindset that was against, the strategy or against the way it was developed. And it kept dawning me why it is OD practitioners were not at the table when the actual conversations around strategy were taking place. Um, so much of what we were seeing at that point in time would essentially help the not only the development of the strategy but also the implementation. So part of it was that you know the big eight consulting companies, they got in to do that work, and then it was passed to us to essentially implement it. And I just felt that OD had something to contribute to strategy development and change throughout the entire life of a strategic change process, not just, you know, in the kind of the designing of interventions. That was one thing. Um, Daniel, you want to take it?
Yeah, for me, one of the things was as I was going through the software change effort that you mentioned, uh, I kept learning new things, particularly from NTL and people in NTL that were immediately applicable. And when we got to the end of that process, and I was helping with some of the NTL training, and we were talking, I was thinking, what do I wish I'd had at the beginning?
Hmm.
And it was a reference, a book that the stuff that I ended up learning along the way, that I wouldn't have to have been encountering it for the first time as I was faced with it. So that was part of the motivation from my side. Dead
So,
silence.
you talk in the book about the importance of the intervention, and you just mentioned that a little bit. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, let me start.
Yeah, yeah.
When we were working with NTL, we were each teaching classes, and one of them was on strategy, and one of them was on interventions. And we got to talking and realized that implementation of strategy is a series of interventions, a series of actions that are taken to move the system along, to help it change its identity. That's when we talk about strategic change, we're talking about change that's going to help an organization change its identity in some way. So it isn't, some, oh, we want to increase this by 2%. That's not a strategic change. It may be a big change for an organization, but it's not a strategic change in our definition. So that was where interventions became the linchpin between the general OD stuff and the strategy stuff.
And I do want to say, I think this book it's like a primer for change management, strategic change management. Would you agree?
I think we would certainly agree that was our aim. The target audience, we were trying to reach, not to the kind of the OD elite or to the OD academia. We were really trying to reach, operational managers, organizational leaders, HR professionals, all of those people who we have found were given the task of creating change in an organization because of their expertise in another area outside of change. So we wanted to give them not only the context, but a full range of everything that would be involved in change. And Daniel, I don't know what you want to add to that.
Well, I mean, what you'll find in the book, there's a lot of places where we stress definitions. Part of that is because people new to the work hear these words and they don't know what they mean, or even people who are in the work, there's 3 or 4 different definitions. So we've tried to be careful to say, okay, when we say this, this is what we mean. So you'll find the definitions, and lots of times we do that with sidebars too to reinforce that, so that okay, this is what they're talking about. And it also then gives a vocabulary to the person who's going to be doing the work to be able to exercise things and communicate things.
Yeah. Let me also say that the other piece about interventions that got to be very important for us is that as we were essentially looking at it, we found that the whole strategic change process, not just the implementation, but the design and rolling out of a strategic development process was a series of interventions, and that OD had something very significant to add at every stage of that process, every stage of that journey.
One of the things we've talked enough about this. One of the things that when you think about communications, lots of times people think of communications as an afterthought, or okay, we've made this decision, but communication in itself is an intervention.
That was my next question.
Okay. And diagnosis in and of itself is an intervention. And the one that as we thought about it, it came as a bit of a surprise to me, but evaluation is an intervention. When you evaluate, whether it's a partial process or a whole thing, when you evaluate those, the actual way in which you do that impacts how the system absorbs that and moves forward. So Lennox, I was talking about the communication and evaluation and other things, that those were interventions. We lost you for a little bit.
Yeah, my question was, how can leaders effectively communicate the need for change to their employees? So And you brilliantly said that it's an intervention. Communication is an intervention
Yep.
in and of itself.
It is, and if the leader is simply communicating to the employees, there's a problem.
Mm.
The communication really needs to be two-way, because the leader does not know everything going on in the system unless it's a 3-person startup. So
Yes.
it's important for the process of developing the strategy to involve other components of the system. You can't, if you're Shell Oil Company, you can't involve everybody directly. You're not going to have 40,000 people in a meeting. But you can look at the particular people who have knowledge in the system beyond just the leaders. Sorry.
And how would one do that?
Well, Lennox, you've done it. Why don't you give an example?
No, well, I mean, the best way to do it is to start at the very beginning, to kind of essentially use OD thinking in not only designing the strategic change process, but also in the very formulation of strategies. So, for instance, one of the things which was a big decision for us in the book is that the first chapter is very important because it doesn't talk about strategic change, it doesn't talk about strategy, and it doesn't really talk about OD. It talks about the world we live in. And that whole concept that when we're dealing with strategy, we are actually looking from the outside in. This is the world we live in, and this is what we have to adjust to. The problem is that most people, when they start to do strategy, they start looking at the organization itself, like, where we want to go, what we want to do, what is the gap. But strategy is the placement of the organization within the wider environment, not internal to the organization. I mean, that integration has to be developed, but in relation to the industry, in relation to the world, in relation to what is happening, across communities and in societies. So all of that gets to be very important. And part of what the leader has to do, and the change agent along with the leader, is that they have to keep the leader or the change team, the strategy architectural team, they need to keep them a little bit ahead of the rest of the organization. So they have the first experience of what is taking place. They go through the feelings of, being overwhelmed, feeling crazed, paralyzed. Are we strong enough to do this? Can we do this? And then begin to use that as a kind of a coaching platform for the organization. If the leaders are not involved in the change process, they cannot have empathy for the people who are going through it. They have a little sense of it, and they oftentimes don't really get the what we call the human process of change that is taking place. And I think that was chapter 2 where we talked about. I have actually forgotten the name. The human experience.
Yeah, human experience of change.
Of change. Yep. Yeah.
And another way of approaching your question is to look at what we consider to be the diagnosis part of the process. And with diagnosis, you first thing you have to do always is define the system. Well, what's the system we're talking about? What are the boundaries? What are the interfaces? Then you say, okay, well, what is the state of the system in its current environment and in the projected environment to come? So you have to understand the environment and where it's going. Then you look at your system and say, okay, how do we fit with that? Then you ask a really important question that some people really fail to ask, which is, does the system need to change? Then, if so, then you say, well, how does it need to change? And what this generates for you is then the case for change. This is the thing you can communicate to everybody that says, this is why we think we need to change. Now, we're going to need your help figuring out how to do that and where we want to go. So,
I love it. We've been talking a little bit about the environment, and I'm just wondering, with emerging technologies like AI and automation, how will that impact an organization's approach to change?
yeah,
I, I I love that question. I think it's a very, very significant question. And I recently I was teaching a class on interventions, specifically on interventions, OD interventions. And part of the task of the class is that they had to design interventions during the period of the class. And normally a task that they would really struggle over, these groups, I mean, they were just turning it out. And then I realized that all of the groups were using ChatGPT to design the interventions.
Wow.
Unfortunately, ChatGPT did not have all the data about what was really happening, both the hard data and the soft data. So it gave them very elaborate, designs for the interventions. But when they actually came to like implementing that in person, they had to make significant adjustments, which they were not ready for because they had not been, they had not needed the bread that intervention takes. So they lost marks for that. But the important thing is that what we know about ChatGPT is that you cannot assume it's accurate. It only uses the information it has, and just putting in the data from surveys or even just questionnaires and different things does not give ChatGPT the picture of the organization that the change team needs in designing it. Daniel,
It is
don't you
only a
answer?
tool,
Yeah.
right?
What?
exactly. That's what I was going to
It's
say.
only a tool.
It's a tool. It can be a very useful tool, but
Mhm.
it does not take the place, at least not yet, of human intuition, empathy, sympathy,
Mm-hmm.
and creativity. So those are the things, you can use it to do certain things. And actually, one of the chapters, I think it's the last chapter, there's a little thing
Yes.
about
Yes.
AI in there,
Yeah.
and the recognition that it is going to change the way we do things.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be very powerful and very useful if used correctly. There are other technologies that it's the same way. Technology is always just a
Mm-hmm.
tool. Now, an automobile is a tool, and I can certainly get to Knoxville from here a lot faster in an automobile than I can if
Mm-hmm.
I walk. So there's nothing wrong with the tool, but I have to understand the limitations of the tool as well.
Right.
So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm dying to show your tree.
okay.
Can I share your tree
Yeah.
visual?
Yes. So the tree was a thinking tool for us to start with as we came up. We had all of this information, all of these different things that we were organizing into chapters. And we realized
Mm-hmm.
that, hey, some of this stuff is really kind of the roots of understanding things. And so that's what we need to put at the front of the book. And then there's the basics of what we're talking about. And so that's where you learn about systems, you learn about how to use yourself, what it's like to be a change leader, all that kind of thing.
And that's the tree trunk.
That's the trunk,
That's the tree.
supports everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Then in the branches, we actually are doing the strategic change process. And there's a typo in here, so I apologize for that. Strategic question, not questions question. So the typo's my fault. I own it.
Okay.
But then from there, you have one branch, which is more the planning part, the thinking about the planning, and then there's a part that is focused more on the interventions, but the two just dovetail together. So I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it was just a question of how to organize it. So
Mhm.
Lennox, what do you want to say about the tree?
Uh, I like the tree also. And we didn't plan it as a tree. We were actually mind mapping a whole series of different topics and what we thought was important. And then the idea of a tree came up to us when we were thinking about, well, how do we present it? And the bottom three kind of circles, the world we live in, the human experience of change, and the approach really get to be the foundation which leads people into a strategic change process. And it is essential for them to know not only the world we live in, but also what does change involve? The OD approach to change, as Daniel was saying, is very, very nuanced, and we pay a lot of attention both to the soft data as well as the hard data. So the tree got to be very important. The part of what the trunk are actually very kind of technical parts of the change process, but at the upper part, the upper right-hand part, a lot of that are contextual factors and dynamics that come up that essentially derail a strategic change process. So that gives you the insight and the perspective about all the other things that you need to be managing as you are creating the strategic change. We know that as you move into a strategic change process, you have other changes that emerge that are unexpected. And how do you manage those, and how do you deal with those, and how do you use that in support of the strategic path that the organization is on? So all of that got to be very, very interesting, and kind of carries us back to the this whole OD maxim that context matters. So I'm really proud of what and I mean, Daniel and I are not the only authors, but there were a series of other people who were also writers, and what they produced was really exceptional.
Can you say, Lennox, can you say a little bit more about the soft data and hard data, and kind of the pitfalls if you don't have both in using your analysis?
Yes, but I think Daniel already referred to it when he started talking about compassion and empathy. Now, but oftentimes people in OD say that your very first contact is an intervention just because you show up. That's a kind of a little bit of a maxim from OD. Just showing up is itself an intervention. However, it isn't just showing up. We know that showing up creates ripples in the organization, but the soft data is essentially a lot of the cultural data about which groups of people get to be acknowledged in meetings and which don't. The nuances around the values that are stated and the values that are in use in the organization. That's often a big discrepancy. So the soft data is like all the cultural data, all the environmental data that we know contributes to performance in organizations. The environment matters. The hard data gets to be a lot of our traditional data and the surveys and the archival information that we either have or that we have to develop in order to bring about a change. And both of those need to be together. Paying attention only to the hard data will give you a strategic plan. It will not give you a strategy formulation process. And we know what happens to strategic plans. I have several upstairs in cupboards and different things. So it really is the soft data gives us the whole human side of what's happening. And, until AI learns how to actually do the change instead of just talk about it, we're going to need human beings to do that.
And one of my favorite quotes is by Franz Trampenars. Culture is not a side dish, it's the main course.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the one I like is culture eats strategy for breakfast.
That's my second favorite quote. Yes, yes. By Peter Drucker, right?
By
So
Peter Drucker,
it doesn't matter how, I mean, your strategic plan can be amazing, but if it isn't aligned with the culture, the chances of success are quite slim. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And let me jump in here.
Yeah, you finish.
The way to get a strategic plan that's aligned with the culture is to involve the culture in the creation of the plan. It's strategic plans that come from the C-suite are likely to fall flat on their face. Now, one that is supported and driven from the C-level people down through the organization and involving people, that works. And that to me is the one of the biggest overall learnings as we put this book together is if you don't get the culture, the people involved in creating the process, you are really wasting an opportunity.
Well, and this is from the 80s, but I love Sidney Yoshida's Iceberg of Ignorance where he talks about, the frontline employees, they know 100% of the organization's problems, right? The C-suite, they think they know 100%, but they really don't. And so you need to involve those employees at all levels so that you can really get a firm grasp of what's really going on here, right?
Yes.
Yep.
One of the chapters that I want to highlight real quick is 19, which is the value of cultural competence.
Oh, yeah.
Early on, we knew that we needed to address diversity in the workplace. And that chapter is a very different approach to looking at the diversity of people in an organization. And it's not organized by, gee, this is the de jure statement about diversity, but instead it's almost a little academic. Lennox had to bring it up out of the totally academic, but it was it's a really good way to think about interactions and for me, I saw it in Shell. In the US, you want to stand out, right? You want to be the top. In the Netherlands, the thing is the tall blade of grass gets cut first. You do not want to stand out. You do not want to be publicly marked as an exceptional person. You want to be part of a team that is. And if you don't understand things like that, your plan is going to run into trouble.
Yep. One comment about that is that we were very intentional about staying away from just the regular DEI talk.
Yes.
And we were emphasizing cultural competence.
Yes.
So much so that people were looking at the book and saying, well, we didn't say enough about diversity. But culture, in the same way we were talking about organizational culture, a more holistic approach to cultures, where we see and we think about what is the competence that this culture brings to the workplace, and what is the competence that this other culture brings to the workplace, really creates, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most level playing fields for us to have conversations about culture and to have conversations via culture to diversity. So that got to be very, very important. The other chapter I'll I want to make mention of, since we looking at individual chapters for a while, is this whole notion about when we're doing this work, people have already been socialized into thinking and behaving a certain way in the organization. And part of our work when we're doing any kind of change process is to essentially, how do we, to some extent, de-socialize people from the ways they have gone about learning and the ways they have been going about thinking in the organization. And that was why we spent a lot of time putting in chapter 9, the staging of change. How do you create physical environments for a different conversation to take place than the ones that have been taking place before? And we actually, these are the things that were not necessarily included in the, the master level OD programs, or, but they are the pieces that really matter when you're in an organization and you're faced with kind of having to bring about change, or there's other misnomer, but kind of bring about transformation. We could spend a lot of time about this whole notion about transformation and what it really is.
And I think good came from the DEI movement. I think that it kind of brought that into the forefront, if you will. But I think cultural competence needs to be the new DEI.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I'd link it with the stuff in 18, which is the harnessing power for change, because a lot of this has to do with perceived and actual power within organizations.
Yeah.
And Lennox, isn't that the only chapter that had 3 authors working together?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So and so they had their own experience of dealing with the power dynamic while writing. It kind of shows up.
And I love your definition of power. Power is the ability to act or produce an effect.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Kimberly,
sometimes you run across things in the book that sound a little like a science definition. I'm a math physics person. I'm sorry.
I love that.
Yeah.
There's just so much I want to talk about. I want to ask you 100 questions all at once. So, can you talk a little bit about ethics and in creating strategic change? How can leaders ensure that change is implemented in an ethical way?
Daniel, you want me to start on that one?
Go ahead. Help
And
yourself.
the reason I asked this question is I've been having a lot of conversations with my students about, what is really ethics? What is ethical, right? And we had a situation where those who are not in the US might not understand this as much as those of us in the US, but Taylor Swift was going to a Kansas City game, and many games, because her boyfriend plays for the Kansas City Chiefs, and she did a call with one of the refs' nieces, right? And so, and I guess she probably sent the niece some swag and stuff like that. And we had a conversation of, okay, that in and of itself is fine, but should the ref then recuse herself from reffing or officiating future games? Because she would have some kind of a bias, right? Because of that interaction. And my students, 100% of them said, yes, she should. And I was kind of proud of them for saying that, because I think that, that's an example of ethics. I mean, it's not illegal for them to do that, but it does kind of create this ethical dilemma, right? And I think that a lot of times we wrestle with those ethical dilemmas more so, or we don't consider them, I should say, as much as we should. Would you agree?
Yeah, and in a narrow sense, for that particular thing, my go-to place is the biblical idea of avoid the appearance of evil.
Ah,
So if there could be an appearance of evil, then you should recuse yourself. And
okay.
but in the larger sense, the ethics of a change are very much driven by the ethics of the company. And so one of the things that we always have encouraged is that the way in which you do the change needs to reflect the future state, how you want to be. So don't do the change the way you used to do stuff if that's not working for you. You need to have a change that reflects the ethics and the morals and the way of functioning that you see yourself going to. So, and Alex, you want to follow up on that?
I really like that.
I think the whole the ethical use of power and the ethical use of influence is getting to be very, very significant. I mean, it always was, but for a long time it was just tied up with this whole thing about not morals but morality, and people got very confused about it. The part of the whole notion about the ethics, and leaders have to really take a stand on this, is about the what is the integrity that the leaders stand on, and what does integrity mean to them? And that comes up a bit in the chapter on power, where we differentiate what power is, what influence is, and what authority is, and the rights and responsibilities of each of those kinds of forms of influence, or forms of using quote unquote power in different ways.
I love that chapter.
Yes. People conflate power and influence and authority, and as we begin to dissect it, a lot of the ethical questions get to be kind of essentially organizational and rights and responsibilities that certain people have, and certain people are accountable for, and others can influence it, but they can't decide about it. So I think the issue of ethics, especially with the amount of work that's going right now into ethics in coaching as part of OD, needs to be paid much more attention to in future. Maybe that's the next chapter.
And there's obviously the right and wrong, right?
Yeah.
But then there's that gray area, and it's just
and
so
that differs,
big.
and that differs a lot in different cultures. That's
right.
part of that cultural
that's such a good point.
Yes.
But the other thing we've kind of skirted around is the ethics of the professional who's helping all this happen. And that kind of comes up some in the chapter 5, use of self.
Yes, self, right.
And how it's important that you don't, as a person that's helping an organization do this, that you don't try and put your set of beliefs on them. You have to accept, and if their set of beliefs is something you can't live with, then you need to get out. I mean, that's it. There are certain organizations that I would not feel comfortable working with. And so I would just say, I'm sorry, you need to find someone who's more aligned with your set of beliefs in this area. But so the ethics of the practitioner are also important.
Yeah. And let me just add that, because part of the ethics of the practitioner is we know enough now that we could very clearly say that the practitioner, the change agent, the OD change agent, especially external, has to be both a part of the organization and a part from the organization.
At the same time.
And yeah, at the same time. And when they begin to get that whole notion, that piece blurred about being a part of and a part from, then they not only do they get into trouble, but they create trouble for others.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, oftentimes, what I mean, the OD practitioner or the consultant, whether it be OD or just kind of change management, they have tremendous not only power but tremendous influence when they come into the organization. And some of them, if they don't manage themselves, they actually use the power and influence as a kind of a weapon for authority. And they have to be very careful that they don't begin to essentially recreate a lot of the power dynamics that are taking place within the organization. I remember the time when kind of OD was very much a little bit like the conscience of the organization, and then somehow it got taken over by management. So it became a tool of management rather than kind of independent of management. And I think we have passed that stage now. And the whole idea is that OD practitioners have to be practicing a certain level of an awareness that is based on how much power and influence they have, and the integrity to talk about the conflicts that could arise when they're doing this work. I mean, the leaders and the whole change team rely on the practitioners to help them to get through this. I think of it as the morass of the swamp that they're going through around this. And the only way to do it is to essentially be very clear about what is one's stance and very clear about the whole notion of integrity, where the integrity begins and where integrity ends. Daniel, I don't know if you might want to even object to some of what I said, I think.
No, it's for me, the thing that kind of covers it is that concept of being in the world but not of the world. So you're in the system, you're part of the system, but you are still tied to the whole OD concept and all of the parameters that go with that and what is appropriate and is not appropriate. And so, yes, you're in there, but if they ask you to do something that you shouldn't do, you have the obligation to say, I won't do that, and this is why. And when you do that, you tend to, yes, there's a little bit of distancing, which isn't necessarily bad, because if they felt close enough to you that they were asking you to do that, that's the first indication you may be too close. But also in doing that, it helps them realize that there are other things in play than just what their wishes are. Because I think we've all run across people who think that just because they want something, it can happen. It's like the manager who asks the person, well, when can you have that done? And the person says, well, I can have it done by April the 15th. Says, fine, I want it by February the 28th.
Yes.
I told you I couldn't get it done by then, but your wish is, it's that disconnect from reality. I've wandered astray from our question, though. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And can you say a little bit more about, okay, we have this tree and it's growing. How often do you go back to the beginning? Right? How often do you circle back to the roots? to strengthen the tree.
Well, I think, and Lennox will correct me here. For me, the times that you go back is the times that you're feeling unsure in the other parts. The tree is swaying or the wind is blowing hard, and so you go back and you say, okay, but what are we rooted in? And then you look at the trunk and say, okay, what's going to hold us there? And yeah, leaves may blow off, or but we don't want the tree to blow over. So for me, I would go back in times when something is happening that I don't understand or whatever, and say, okay, what am I missing? What do I need to look at? Go ahead, Lennox.
I love that.
Yeah. I think what I want to add to that is that it's not like a linear process that you go and then one stage is finished and you move on to the other things. Especially with the roots. The roots always have to be there. And the roots are being grounded in what's happening in the world, gets to be very, very significant. I mean, when COVID hit, the world had to change, and the world changed overnight in a couple of weeks. And people had to face, I know HR officers and managers and VPs, they had to face tough questions that had always been on the had always been there, but they hadn't dealt with, including things that we have grown accustomed to, like working from home and the ethics and the controls around working from home. And they have to do that in a way that they are continuing to help people go through the transition of all those changes. The human experience of change.
And that goes to number 16, right? The agile strategic change framework.
Yes.
You always got to pay attention and keep going back.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought about as we were talking about this is, I teach one of my granddaughters science as part of her homeschooling, and we had to think about the trees. The roots have the function of stabilizing the tree, but also they take the water and the nutrients, and then the trunk transports those up into the branches and the leaves. But the branches and the leaves are what make the food. The roots don't make food. The trunk doesn't make food. The food is made up there, and during the course of the year, it comes back down through the trunk into the roots for storage. So that's the other thing is, as you have your experience, you need to fold in those parts of the world that you live in and your experience of change and the experience of change that you're seeing in others, and how the approach may need to change. I mean, these are not fixed points in space, but they're areas that are solid and hold the information that you need for that. If that made any sense at all.
Yeah, is that biology? Did we have a little biology lesson?
Yeah, we had a little biology. Yeah.
I have a question. Why are 16 and 22, are they peach colored?
They are the culmination of the chapters before them. So 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 give you all of the stuff that culminates in 16.
Okay.
And similarly, 22 is a culmination of 17 through 21. Which is, and I know that some people, the best way for them to read this book is to, that chapter sounds interesting, I'll go there. For me, we set it up so that we would think that a person would go through the whole thing in order. It reads that way. You can do it independently, but a lot of the definitions and ways of thinking kind of build as you go.
Yep. Yes. No. Very, very much so. Very much so. Coming back to your question, Kimberly, about like returning to the roots. I mean, I think that's a question that we have to face. Like, but the way I would frame it is like, how do we make strategizing an ongoing operational part of an organization, rather than something, when the world changes,
We have to
we'll
react.
think about, right.
Right.
And I do think it is necessary, not only that the communications unit, the communications department realize that part of their work is not only internal communications, but to keep bringing what is happening in the outside world into the organization, and the operational and planning areas. I think they have to put um, some part of the, once a year, or at least once every, if not once a year, every 18 months, some occasion where people have to talk about um, how is the existing strategy going, and are we really living into the existing strategy? Um, what I have found is that, the strategy just kind of begins to get, to almost retrieve to the backstage, um, and um, and then that's when uh, we are kind of essentially doing things in a very kind of a non-strategic way,
Yes.
when we are putting value on the things we shouldn't be putting value on. I'm a firm believer that every organization has a strategy. It is embedded in the way they operate, in the way they work, even though they mightn't even have spent the time becoming conscious of it. But it is there. I see Danielle is having a great time laughing.
Well, it's overt and covert. I mean,
Yes.
you have an
Oh,
overt
yes.
strategy or you have a covert strategy.
But
Right.
there's always one.
Yeah.
Yes.
The other thing in this discussion is if you look at in 16, the agile strategic framework, one of the things that you have to keep doing is you keep going back and looking at, okay, have any of these assumptions changed? Have any of these decisions changed? Has any of this information changed? And if that's significant enough and you're doing the diagnosis, does the system need to change? Okay, yes. Well, let's move along. So yeah, when you're agile, you no longer are stationary.
Right. And you have to constantly be evaluating and reevaluating this, not just waiting until there's a hit on the numbers, right? I
Right.
mean, it needs to be a continual process.
Yeah, if there's a hit on the numbers that isn't directly correlated to some really unexpected event in the external world, then you're not doing your job.
Yep.
Right.
I know that's easy for me to say because I'm retired.
Hi, I appreciate that. I wasn't sure what to expect with this discussion, and I'm absolutely delighted to see your framework here and how you laid the book out, which, by the way, I just went on Amazon and purchased one. But I might purchase a couple because I know some others that would be interested in it. And I'm particularly interested in how you arrived at Agile being a key part to this. It's kind of like at the end state of that one, you got two branches, it looks like, and one of them is kind of like, hey, Agile is kind of an important piece to this. Full disclosure, I am a doctoral candidate for organizational development change with Steve Cady and Bowling Green State University.
Okay.
Yes.
And so I've been working with him to try to operationalize agile organizational development change at scale for large, organizations, which is what I do for my own practice as largely as a software development leader. So I want to bring these two worlds together because I see them very compatible. So I don't see a lot of folks talking like this, and recently a little bit, maybe there's a smaller circle of people that are influenced by it. Now, within the last year or two, I've seen a little bit of discussion about it, but not a lot. And so I'm looking forward to reading how you arrived at that and your strategic change framework. I think it's going to be very interesting. So I thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to listen to you guys talk.
Thanks, Sean. I'm primarily to blame for for that, because
Yeah.
I was also working in software at Shell, and that it was like, gee, these
They
two
belong
come
together. Yeah.
Yes.
I have a
So,
saying. I have a saying that I coined recently, that agile comes full circle to home with OD, which is, I believe if you go look at all of the principles of the fundamentals of agile, they're all basically draw their roots from
Yeah.
OD, and so it just seems like somehow, you know, it branched off and did its own thing for a little while, but it's time for it to come home and
yeah,
help OD be better.
I think it survived. It might not have the editing process, but in some place I actually talked a little bit about
Oh,
the Agile
Agile
Manifesto and how it
Manifesto, yeah.
maps.
Yeah.
So,
What,
yeah,
could you say that again, Daniel?
I said in the book, and I'd have to double check, but I remember writing about
Yeah.
how the Agile Manifesto maps onto the strategic part.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and what Sean is saying is exactly right. I mean, it's just a manifestation of OD in a extremely dynamic environment.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's there's so many things that that as I started to get into OD, spoke to me in ways that my practical experience as somebody implementing large scale agile efforts in software development, but also hardware as well, and mostly in aerospace and defense. But I also had experience in the military. I spent 32 years in the military, and my beginnings of agile understanding happened back in the early 90s, when they were trying to implement total quality leadership, total quality management initiatives.
Yep.
And then later, when I was in combat environment, leading soldiers in a very dynamic and dangerous circumstance where failure usually resulted in maiming or death. I implemented agile methods, which I didn't realize at the time that's what I was doing, but it seemed like the best way to disrupt the enemy's plan against me. Because if you did something twice, the third time they're going to get you. And maybe they get you the second time. So I had to build into the way we did things an adaptive approach that changed constantly to disrupt the enemy. And but the particular area that I was working in was counter improvised explosive devices. So you know, you make a mistake there one time and you probably won't survive it. Someone will learn from it, though. It just won't be you.
Yeah.
And you were recognizing the way that the external environment changed because they were getting information about how you were doing things.
Yeah.
And so that
I saw what was happening. I would read intel reports, and I realized that we had to have a different approach because it was killing lots of soldiers. And so I literally was one of the first guys in the Army to design an approach for dealing with IDs. And I did that in combat with no training, no specialized equipment, had to figure all that out. And they would start giving me equipment once I started having success, but I had to survive a few things before they started giving me the equipment I needed to actually put some theory to practice and prove that it worked.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of change efforts I've heard, although not with such high stakes.
Yeah. My biggest problem these days is, and I don't mean to monopolize all the time, Lillian. If you have questions, please.
No, this is fascinating.
But one of I have big problems right now where I'm the executive leadership always wants to speak in the definitive terms of waterfall, and that's what they know and appreciate and like, and so bringing those two worlds together with some kind of a hybrid or an interface is often the struggle. And I've still struggled getting executives to support Agile, even though they like the benefits of it. They don't really necessarily appreciate them. They always think of Agile as something that somebody else goes and does and delivers to them, and they don't recognize that it's that they need to change and be more adaptive themselves. And I also think of Agile in a broader sense. I think it's more than just like one project management style versus another. It's really a revolution in the way that we do business, and it becomes incredibly important because of that chapter 14, that VUCA world that we're in. That rate of change has really accelerated quadratically, and that demands leaders operate differently. So anyway, I didn't mean to capitalize all the time.
No, I mean,
Oh,
I
no.
often think about Kurt Lewin, you know, when he had the, you know, is it
Behavior.
unfreeze?
Yeah. Oh, okay.
You
Yeah.
know, if freeze or
Yeah.
unfreeze, change,
Unfreeze,
and
move,
refreeze,
phases.
you know,
Yeah.
how often did he expect that to happen? Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I think it's interesting. It's interesting, but I think that things have changed so much. There's like a raging debate right now in a lot of the software development world where, you know, agile is dead. You'll see, you know, some people say, and it makes me laugh because it's such a myopic way of thinking about it. It's hard. That doesn't mean it's dead. It's actually more needed, and it has changed what the founders and I'm not even sure that it's appropriate to call them founders, but the Agile Manifesto is largely thought of as the founding document. But really, roots go further back than that by a lot.
Oh,
yeah.
And all those guys probably didn't have original ideas. They just all came together and put it pen to paper for the first time and said, hey, here's an approach that we believe in. But I think since then it's changed and will continue to change and evolve, and it's branched out to lots of other things. So I'm really interested to see this. The timing of this is very good. I literally was asked to do a management presentation at the Academy of Management in Copenhagen in July, their annual meeting. And this is the topic that I'm going to do my thesis on, and in this area anyway. So I literally just wrote out a title for a thesis. I don't know if it'll actually be my thesis, but it's an interesting one. It's in line with this, and so this book is going to be very informative to me. So I appreciate you writing it.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
That's you're exactly the kind of person we're trying to reach.
The word agile was kind of a buzzword for a little while, right? And now, you know, now that we need to take it from kind of the buzzword phase to, you know, it's I don't know what it's a core tenet, right? Of
it's interesting you say that. I recently had convinced some leaders to implement something known as a value management office, which is basically taking a project management office with a waterfall approach and turning it into a more agile approach to oversee and manage. It's not really manage, but provide some governance, let's put it that way, to agile efforts. And I gave them the briefing. I never once mentioned the word agile, never once mentioned scaled agile. I just talked about, you know, why it was a better approach and what we would do differently. And at the end, they were all for it. But if I walked in there and said, hey, we need to do agile, and scaled agile is a good way to inform us, they would have immediately said, no.
Yes.
Yep.
So I learned that lesson already, and you're very right. The buzzword tends to freak people out. So, and Daniel, I like what you said about definitions too, because that's a big problem with agile. Is I discover this all the time, is that everyone has different meanings for words, and they kind of talk past each other, and it creates all kinds of confusion. And it's part of the reason why I really appreciate scaled agile framework, because I can point people to that's the definition of this word,
right, and
get everybody on the same sheet of music, and then it helps a lot with avoiding confusion.
I just want to thank you guys for we did this, and I realized later I said this was going to be an epic conversation. In our first one, we were hacked, and that was a little bit epic. We'll just say that.
Yes.
So, but I think this one was epic in another way. I feel like we really addressed some really strategic change management dialogue, and I think I can't recommend this book enough. This book is just truly incredible. And you know, I think every master's level, every PhD level, every practitioner should read this book. And I just really want to thank you for joining us today and having this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kimberly.
Yeah, we appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.